In this video, we're going to explore some great tips to help improve composition in your street photography and take photos like this, this, and this. Building a composition around colour and using colour as the focus of an image is a really powerful compositional tool. Maybe you go out and you just focus on looking for one specific colour, and then you can use that colour as an anchoring point or a focal point of the photograph. You're essentially making that photograph all about just that one colour. So for example, in my work, I like to use red a lot as pops of colour, as little focal points within my photographs. It's something that I'm really attracted to when I'm out about on the street. I like the colour red. I think it's really powerful, and I use it when I'm not quite sure what I'm looking for out on the street, when I'm not quite sure how I want to compose an image. I think, well, what's a strong colour that I can use to then give myself a basis to then make a photograph from? Unless you shoot always in black and white, then in which case you might want to ignore this one, but maybe you would like to go actually and experiment with colour for a change, then getting to grips with colour theory, getting a basic understanding of how colours work with each other, how colours interact with each other and create pleasing things to look at, then that can really benefit your street photography. The other great thing about colour is that it can really evoke different emotions in people. You know, what you're trying to get from a viewer of your street photograph is for them to be engaged with it. You want them to look at it, you want them to find it interesting, you want them to move their eye around it and feel something really. You know, if you make a street photograph and someone has an emotional reaction to it or feels something from when they look at it, then that's a really powerful, really strong photograph. And using colour can really help towards gearing that emotion in a viewer. Colours have different connotations and different emotions attached to them depending on who you are, you know, but there's general themes throughout colours that are widely accepted to have certain connotations. So for example, red, it can be anger or danger or passion or love. And playing with those emotions of the viewer by using that colour really makes for a strong compositional tool. The next tip is to play with perspective. So we're all used to seeing things from eye level, and a lot of street photography or photography in general is taken from eye level, so the perspective is always quite similar. So what you might want to do is try changing your perspective to make for a more interesting photograph, or at least to get your creative eye in, or just get you thinking along different lines and trying different things really. Street photography is all about creativity and experimentation, and just trying different things will make you a better street photographer over time. It's definitely worth exploring different angles of shooting. So if you're used to shooting at eye level, maybe try shooting from a bit higher up, or shooting from lower down, or tilting the camera at a different angle to give you a different perspective as well. You know, who said horizons always need to be straight? It's definitely a great thing to try, is just experimenting with perspective. For example, in this photograph here, which I took in Paris, it was a really quite miserable rainy day, but the rainy conditions led to some quite successful street photography. I changed my perspective to look down at the pavement rather than just focusing everything on eye level, and all it needed was for someone to walk past into that reflection, and for me this is a really, really strong photograph. It's one that I really like a lot, and it all came from just looking at things in a different way, changing my perspective, looking down rather than straight ahead. So yeah, changing your perspective is a really strong way of being creative and coming up with new, exciting and different compositions. And that leads me into the next tip, which is shooting from the hip. Now, it kind of depends on what camera you've got, if you can do this easily or not, but if you've got a camera with a tilting screen, you can definitely shoot holding your camera down at hip level, waist level, and that has a number of positive effects for creating interesting compositions. Firstly, it can make you less noticeable, so it's quite easy to be noticed when you move your camera up to your eye. That movement, or even if you're holding your camera around here, that can be a trigger for people to notice you. People notice that kind of movement. People are familiar with people trying to take photographs these days. And secondly, it can give you a different perspective, and it can allow you to get closer to people and capture those unguarded, candid moments that us street photographers love to do. If you're shooting from the hip, you give yourself more of a chance to be unnoticed, to have that different perspective, and to really capture those candid moments that make for precious street photos. Shooting from the hip isn't creepy if you do it with good intentions. You're not aiming to conceal yourself, but you're just aiming to be unobtrusive. You want to be in the moment and around and part of those street scenes. You don't want to impact it in any way, because you want to capture a natural unfolding moment. This next tip is one of my favourite things to talk about in street photography, and one of my favourite things to explore, which is creative framing. If you think about it, there's so many interesting different things that you can use to create frames when you're out on the street. The options are unlimited really. It just comes down to how creative you want to be. I've talked about on this channel before why subframing or framing in general can make for really compelling street photographs. But this is more, I guess, the tip or the technique or what you might want to be looking for to then make and capture those interesting moments and that interesting framing. When you go out, just think about the different things you could use as frames, anything that could potentially make for a frame or a little bit of visual interest in your photo, and then think about how you can use those elements to form the basis of your composition. Can you incorporate some of the other things we've discussed already, like colour, into your frame as well? So if you have a frame and some interesting colour and put them together, then you're suddenly starting to really explore different, more interesting compositions and creating more interesting, visually compelling street photos. If things aren't really happening for you and you're not quite sure how to compose a shot, just find some interesting elements that will make a frame. Wait for people to walk through and see if you can capture them when they're in that frame. And then just practice and experiment. And that's the joy and the fun of creating interesting street photographs and interesting compositions. It's just seeing how far you can push a scene creatively, seeing how patient you can be, seeing how you can challenge yourself, and just looking for those elements all the time when you're out. You can also create negative space by blocking off a portion of your image. Like, try something quite severe, you know, try a really big block of color and have a little part of the image that is the subject that you've got. And just see if you're starting to create images that you like, and see how that develops over time into a new style, or building on your current style and adding more tools to your arsenal when you're out on the street. Using framing or creative framing and then building on those ideas will always give you something to be looking for when you're on a street photography walk. And that can often be the challenge, is that you're out, there's nothing much going on, but if you're looking for frames, then it gives you a starting point, it gives you a basis of a composition for your photograph, and that can often mean that the hardest hurdle for making an interesting street photograph, you've already overcome it. This tip is probably the most important one of all, and that is to subscribe to my channel. But yeah, if you are finding this video useful, then please go ahead and give it a like, a comment, all of that good stuff really helps support me and the channel and gets my videos out there for more people to enjoy. The next tip is to change up your focal length, depending on whether you like to shoot longer or wider, or you haven't changed in a while. So for example, let's say you usually shoot details and you have quite a long focal length, then maybe try a wider focal length. You can then start to experiment with different compositions because you're trying something new, and often when you try something new, it can be quite inspirational. Obviously a little scary, you're going to make lots of mistakes and lots of trial and error, but when you try something new, it can definitely spark new creative ideas. Try a wider angle lens shot to show the scale of an environment. Pick out one figure and use that figure as the anchor of your composition, showing off that really interesting environment. People will argue until the cows come home about what is or isn't street photography, and that's not what this video is about. I am interested in that question too, and I will do videos about that in the future. But regardless of what street photography means to you, there's definitely different ways you might want to go about it. So that's if you want to try using a wider angle lens. What you might want to do as well is also try a longer focal length. Then your street photography will completely change, your compositions will change, and the way you're looking at things will change when you change your focal length. Again, I won't go too in depth on this because I think it warrants a whole separate video about different focal lengths and how you might want to use them. But let's just say you're using a longer focal length to try out new compositions. You might then start to focus on more detailed oriented images. You might compress the scene a little bit more, and then the street photo then becomes less about the environment and more about the detail. Using a longer focal length as well allows you to stand a bit further away from your subjects. You then might be able to capture more candid moments, and then you also might be able to fill the frame with the subject that you're interested in or that you found engaging when you're on the street. And the last tip is to incorporate the environment in your street photos. You can use the environment to create layers in your photo. The more layers you have, and this goes back to one of the tips earlier about subframing, the more layers you have in an image, the more depth it has. It can give it more visual interest, it can give it more texture, and it can make more impactful photos. A lot of my street photography used to be quite simple and quite basic, and then I got a bit bored of that kind of style, and I wanted to start including more in the frame just to give a bit more interest, a bit more texture, and get that depth that I wanted. So to do this, you can look at what's around you on the street. You can shoot through objects, you can use reflections, you can use glass windows, or anything really that can just give you a bit of colour, a bit of texture, a bit of blurriness to your photo. Those are the things that, for me, make a photo stand out, or at least give it a bit more visual interest in your composition by using layering and your environment. To explore how to make your street photography compositions even more powerful, check out this video here where I talk through my best tips to make incredible street photographs using light and shadow.